A big Shabbat is coming as we read two Torah portions, Vayakhel and Pikudei, and finish off the second book of the Torah, Sefer Shemot, the book we call Exodus, and the book very significantly, the Ramban titles as Sefer HaGeula, the book of redemption, the Jewish people having experienced exile in Egypt. It's also Shabbat HaChodesh because Rosh Chodesh Nisan falls during next week. And so there's a special Torah reading at the end, and we bless the new month coming. So it's a busy, hectic time. And of course, the specter of the first Seder looming over everybody makes it even more exciting. The book of Shemot, the second book of the Torah, concludes very dramatically. And I know each year I try to resist from reading the last sentence of the Torah of this book, but it says, Ki anan Hashem ala mishkan yamam ve'esh tiyeh layla. There was a cloud of glory resting on the Mishkan, on the tent of meeting during the daytime, and fire burning above it at night, before the eyes of all the Jewish people throughout all their wanderings. And there are many concepts here, but let's just go with one right now. And that is that this becomes a permanent experience of standing at Mount Sinai and receiving the Torah. In other words, the Jewish people had a traveling revelation and presence of God in their midst, in many ways as dramatic as it was standing at the foot of Mount Sinai and hearing Hashem's voice. Because the Jewish people were they could see, they could smell, they could hear, they were aware that this Mishkan was the center place of connecting heaven to earth, not by virtue of its physical location, which moved from place to place throughout the wilderness, settled in the city of Shiloh for 369 years after Joshua led the Jewish people in, and eventually becomes the first temple at the time of Shlomo, of King Solomon, not by virtue of its place, but by virtue of its spirituality, by virtue of the fact, just as the vision of Jacob was a ladder connecting heaven and earth, there was a tangible connection going on there. And you can think to yourself, wow, such an exciting development in the world, an entire nation, a couple of million people, settled around a center point, a centering point of a Mishkan, of a tent of meeting, and with God's presence looming and ever present there 24/7 to an extent that was intense and palpable. And yet, the description the rabbis give us is that this was merely a return back to the status of the world during the times of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel and Leah. Because their simple tents, as they moved from place to place, they also created this tangible bridge between heaven and earth, this connection. And it went on every day of their lives. The candles lit on Friday night burned from week to week, just like the menorah. The bread baked for Shabbat lasted throughout the week and was as fresh as the moment it was baked. There was a cloud hovering over the tents themselves. So it's interesting to think about the idea in modern terms of celebrating a return to what was. And that has a lot to do with this idea of the subject of this class, tikkun, the process of repair. The word Tikkun Olam is on everybody's lips. It means totally different things for each and every person in the world. But just let's stay with the word repair. Tikkun, nitaken, means to repair something. So in other words, if I have a tie and it has a little rip in it and I'm able to weave it back together so that the fabric is joined again as it was originally, it has been repaired, reinstated, renewed, whatever word you want to describe it as, it's a return to what was. And I just want to center us for the idea, and I think whenever we hear the word tikkun, tikkun olam, We hear the word tikkun also when somebody celebrates a yortzeit. You'll go to the shul and they'll say, have a tikkun here, make a bracha, mention God's name, be cognizant of God in memory of that person. That also evokes a sense of merit for the person. So this sense of tikkun harbors back in time. Ultimately, it harbors back to the moment when Adam and Chava were placed into the Garden of Eden to inhabit that setting in complete harmony and with a sense of eternity in relation to God. See, so there's this sense of I don't want to say back to the future because that's a misnomer here. There's a sense of God having launched the world with a certain purpose and focus and clarity and intensity. And then over time, that fabric becomes torn apart, and we as human beings are given the capacity to restore and renew and to reinstate this sense of perfect harmony as individuals, as a community, as a Jewish people, and ultimately for the world at large. So that's the sense of tikkun. So Tikkun Olam doesn't mean that I've got a great new progressive idea how to make the world better, and that's going to be my gauntlet of Tikkun Olam. But rather, Tikkun Olam means to recreate a sense of perfect harmony and unity and oneness between the creator and the creation. And that's the sense that was conveyed to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where it says that God showed them the garden, took them around, gave them a tour. And then the Midrash adds, and what was God showing them? He says, look what a world I've created. Guard it. Remember those words, watch over it, protect it, keep it pristine, and not by not throwing a used bottle on the ground, but rather keep it pristine, keep it aligned with the clarity and purpose of the world. And that's tikkun. Okay, tikkun olam. We have tikkun hamidot, people repairing their character with the sense that each and every one of us possesses a pure soul. That we say every morning, Elokai neshama shenatata bi, God placed a pure soul within me. And it's my job to develop that soul, to protect it, to bring out all the good that's within it, and to actualize all the potential for good. That's tikkun, and we talk tikkun hamidot, through perfecting my character, becoming less jealous, less subject to anger, less self-focused. And we're going to look and see how all these ideas are really captured in the Torah reading that we're going to read this Shabbat. But first, I want to repeat a story. It's a famous story, and it's told about Rebbe Yisrael Salanter. It's embellished in many different ways, but the simplicity of the story goes as follows. Yisrael Salanter was known as a very thoughtful, inward-focused person. A lot of documentation in the last 30, 40 years showing how he dealt with subconscious forces within psyche way before Freud was born, and how he was an inward-looking person looking to perfect and repair and renew and to bring out goodness within a person. And the story is that once, very late at night, he was walking and he noticed a simple shoemaker sewing a pair of shoes. And he remarked to the shoemaker, "So late?" And the shoemaker said, and it's quoted in Yiddish, I heard the quote in Hebrew, which I understand much better, Kol zman shehaner daluk, as long as the candle's burning, efshar litakein, it's possible to repair. And I've always thought of this story as being, look, you're never too old, time has not passed you by, don't give up on yourself. But more recently, what's striking to me about the story, about the words that went to the heart of Rebbe Yisrael Salanter and so inspired him in terms of his own practice of Judaism, in terms of his outreach to his fellow Jews, is the idea that as long as the candle's burning, as long as we have our eyes open and we can recognize what is in need of repair, then we can act upon that. And that's the theme I want to look at in this week's Torah reading, and I think it'll become clearer as we do it. The first word of the Parsha, it's on chapter 35, sentence 1, page 516 in the Stone Chumash. Vayakhel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Israel. Moshe gathered the entire assembly of the Jewish people. He talks about Shabbat, and then he initiates the project of building this Mishkan, gathering the material that's necessary, harnessing the labor and the expertise and the artisanship it would be needed to construct it and to launch this project on its way. What's happening here? Let's remember the context. The Jewish people had stood at Har Sinai at Mount Sinai. The Jewish people listened to the 10 commandments being spoken. The Jewish people were elevated in a Kabbalistic sense to a pristine human integrity of status. There's even mention in the Kabbalistic literature that those Jews became no longer subject to death, just as Adam and Chava, when they were created, were not subject to their physical nature coming to an end. They were elevated to the greatest height. And sadly, what happened? 40 days later, despairing about seeing Moshe, feeling lost in the wilderness, they built an egel, they built a golden calf, they worshipped it. Again, there's a lot of nuances, and we've discussed it in the past, what that sense was. And they fell from that level. So here Rashi sets the stage for us. What is this idea of Moshe gathering everybody together? So Rashi says very dramatically, it was the morning after the first Yom Kippur. It was the Jewish people had just attained forgiveness for the sin of the golden calf. It didn't put them back on the same level they were that they were elevated to at Mount Sinai, but it put them in a position now that they could build a Mishkan. And as we see at the end, the conclusion of these two parshiot that conclude the book of Exodus, they could achieve the sense of God's presence, filling the Mishkan with holiness and joining heaven and earth, so to speak, in an unbroken connection. They were ready to do that. And I think, so they had to be gathered together. There had to be a sense of unity. The nuance of the sentence, according to different commentators, they had to hear the charge to build the Mishkan all together at the same time. And they needed all to be involved in achieving it. Each of these components are very, very big lessons. But to me, what it harkens back to is that when you look at the beginning of the sin of the golden calf, which is on page 494 in the Stone Chumash, it's the beginning of chapter 32. Interestingly, the word is Vayakhel ha'am al Aaron. The same word, Kehillah, gathering, creating a sense of community. Only here, the purpose was to build a golden calf. It came from a place of despair. It came from a place of hopelessness. It came from a point that the lights had gone out, so to speak, so that there was no vision, there was no awareness of what could be done in a positive sense. There was just a desperate flailing about, something has to be done. Moshe seems to be lost. We need to breach the most fundamental concepts of Judaism out of desperation so that we could have a leader, we could have someone we could point to, something physical, we could point to and say, this is what took us out of Egypt. This is what's going to guide us into the future. Such a tremendous fall. So here I want to just pick up on this nuance. Moshe understood that if the Jewish people had formed a community to build the egel, to build the golden calf, they needed to be gathered as a community to launch the project of creating the Mishkan and therefore elevating the Jewish people, rectifying the sin, and giving us a permanent opportunity to stay connected to God, to make permanent again the experience at Har Sinai. So you see the sense of tikkun. Moshe was clear-eyed in the following sense. Moshe had all the details. It was taught to him what the Mishkan should look like. In fact, Moshe himself does the setup. But Moshe is careful and said, if the breach of the sanctity of the Jewish people took place by massing and gathering together all as one, so to speak, with the idea of desperately saying, Eila Elokecha Yisrael, this is our God's Israel, or whatever exactly that meant, it needed to be repaired and it needed to be restored through that same medium. And I think this is why the commentaries say they had to all hear it from Moshe. Let's get started building a Mishkan. Because they had heard at Mount Sinai have no molten images, and yet they had gathered as a community, and the stark sense of responsibility and acknowledgement of sin that the Jewish people needed if they were going to repair the internal damage, the spiritual damage, if they were going to renew and restore this relationship with God, it had to happen through this same sense of gathering as a community. And that's how the Parsha begins. It's a big insight into tikkun. It's a big insight into personal tikkun. And to me, it brings to light, pun intended, the nuance of what Rebbe Yisrael said. As long as there is light, we can repair. Yes, it takes time, you need life to do it, but you also need light. There needs to be a sense of acknowledgement. There needs to be a sense of responsibility. There needs to be a sense of clarity. And in a certain sense, by reminding the Jewish people of the outset of the process that led to the creation of the calf, the golden calf, then the people could face up to the necessity of joining together and building a Mishkan so that they could restore and renew this relationship to Hashem. We see this again in the following regard. If you turn to chapter, again, 35, it's just sentence 27. An odd little sentence in the Torah, no sentence is little, but it says, V'anasiim heviu et avnei Hasham v'et avnei mamurim lo'ifod v'lachoshen. A little detail here. The Nasiim, the 12 leaders of each of the tribes, they brought the precious gems and stones which were placed into the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol in order to complete the work of preparing for the Mishkan. Yet, the word Nesiim is spelled incorrectly. It's missing a yud. It's never spelt this way anyplace else. Why is it missing a yud? Rashi informs us based on the Medrash. When Moshe launched the project, let's get moving. Let's gather all the material. Let's gather the talents. Let's start building this Mishkan. The 12 Nesiim, and we're going to discuss there's various shades as to what motivated them to do so. They stepped aside and they said, okay, let everybody get started, start bringing what's necessary, start building. We're leaders. We'll oversee what's taking place. And whatever's lacking, we'll fulfill. We're wealthy. We have a lot of means at our disposal. You people, you get ready. You build. You put this thing together. And when you need something, just call us. Here's my cell phone, 24/7. Let me know what I can do. You need some more money. You need some expertise. You need some advice. You need some direction. Whatever you need, just call me. Rashi, when he quotes the Medrash, uses the word atzlus. It was laziness. The Kli Yakar seems to clarify it was lack of valuing the opportunity to repair the sin of the golden calf. They didn't understand that this window of opportunity had opened, and for them to stand aside and become observers, albeit thinking that they're under pedestal, and sincerely committing themselves to fill up any gap and to make up any void. And if there'd be, if there'd be a deficit at the end, send me the mortgage and I'll burn it for you. That attitude itself failed to appreciate the nature of tikkun, the nature of what was taking place. So there's a sense of laziness, there's a sense of lack of enthusiasm, a sense of lack of zrizut, of alacrity, but most profoundly, it was a misunderstanding of what does it take to rectify and repair a breach that has taken place. And the answer is it takes all hands on deck, shoulder to shoulder, working together. Now, later on in the Torah, in the book of Bamidbar, chapter 7, where the dedication of this Mishkan is detailed, the Torah devotes no less than 74 sentences to what the Nesiim brought. Each Nasi, each leader of a tribe, came with an elaborate dedicatory gift. And they insisted they didn't compete with one another, they took their turns. But the idea was before this Mishkan is inaugurated, we need the opportunity to make our personal gift, our leadership gift, express our dedication to the dedication of the Mishkan. And there the Torah explains a great deal. Now, this is the nature of God, and it's something to reassure all of us. It's consistently presented in the Torah and in traditional sources that breaches, to whatever measure they're punished, mitzvot, good deeds, repairing, tikkun, is rewarded 1,000 times more. So you see, so the Nesiim lost a yud, they lost a letter in their names. And it shouldn't be belittled because, someone said it's as if they built a statue honoring you and they spelled your name wrong on the statue. So forever you're going to drive by and say, well, that's me. Well, that's you. They didn't even get your name right. I mean, you're so famous, you're so important. And that's the sense of what the Nesiim's lack of understanding of that it takes an internal drive to repair something. And the internal drive that's required begins with clarity and recognition. And they lack this recognition. And the Torah can't help but note it, because the Torah wants us to understand that when we acknowledge wrongdoing on our own part, when we see a failure in the way we treat another person, if we see a failure, a character flaw within ourselves, if we see ourselves shirking responsibility, we have to muster an enthusiasm to repairing that breach and to rectifying ourselves and making it better. And right here in the very same chapter of Vayakhel, the Torah is detailing that for us, and it's comparing it to what it's going to write later on in the Torah, in the fourth book of the Torah, in terms of lauding the Nesiim themselves for, on a personal level, recognizing the fact that if we stood aside in the initiation of this Mishkan, we have to stand at the forefront of the building and creation of the dedication of it. Another example, and this example is not quite analogous, but we read about the laver here, the kior. It's chapter 37, sentence 8. It's a very odd sentence that's difficult to understand. And it reads as follows. Let me get to the right place here. Also in Vayakhel, sorry. It reads as follows. Chapter 37, Hayas es hakior nechoshet. They made the laver. The laver is at the entrance to the Mishkan, and the Kohanim, as they would enter to do the service, had to wash their hands and feet. They did it simultaneously. They poured water over their right hand and right foot. They poured water over their left hand and left foot. The es kano nechoshet, and it says bimirot hatzvaot asher tzavu petach olam moed. Very translated many different ways but here it's translated in keeping with the Medrash. It was done with the mirrors that were contributed by the women, the legions of mirrors. Backstory from Rashi: the women came and they said, you need copper. We're going to contribute the very mirrors that we use to beautify ourselves in Egypt, which encouraged the continuity of Jewish life by encouraging our downtrodden, overworked, enslaved husbands to continue creating families and being with us so we'd beautify ourselves and we would use these mirrors with purity and holiness within our marriages to keep the Jewish people going. You need copper. Here's copper. Use this copper for the Mishkan. And Rashi explains from the Medrash, Moshe said, we can't use this. This is it's not pristine. It's not. God says this is the most precious of all the contributions. And then Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch points out something very amazing that I only discovered now, and that thanks to Rabbi Avi Finkelstein in Israel quoting it. They didn't even melt them down. They just hammered them together. And that's this idea of mirot hatzvaot. They joined them together. Everything else that was contributed was melted down, amalgamated. These mirrors, because of what they represented in terms of positive tikkun, that because these mirrors were the implements and the catalyst for the continuation of the Jewish people, even though they were associated with the physical husband-wife relationship, they had such sanctity and such pristineness that they went into the making of the implement for the temple untouched. They were simply joined together. And that's an understanding of the word tzivot. And then another thing Rabbi Finkelstein pointed out, the Baal HaTurim, an interesting, unusual commentary on the Torah, says the word mirot appears 4 times in the entire Tanakh. One, it appears earlier when it says that Jacob saw b'mirot halayla, like he saw an image, because after all, what is a mirror? And a mirror shows you an image. So if I hung up on myself, I use my mirror to look at my own image. Jacob was shown an image in the middle of the night to reassure him that God was with him. Here, these mirrors are being contributed for the laver. And in the book of Yechezkel, in the book of Ezekiel, twice, it's used to describe an image of God Almighty. So what do we see here? We see here a sense of how ready the world is to be elevated through the choices we make and through us taking from the world, using everything that's physically created, using everything that's emotionally within us, and encompassing every aspect of every relationship that we're in. Once it's elevated, it takes on such a tremendous sense of sanctity that it's perfect. It's never in need of repair. It's to be used and maintained exactly in the condition it is. And that's the story here. The story is one of, there's Nodva Rucho. There were people whose spirit was filled with generosity. And according to Yerochem, they contributed the material. And then there was Noso Libo, people whose hearts literally rose up, again, in the sense of tikkun, and they could create artistically. They could do the weaving and the goldsmithing and the silversmithing and the refining and all the special arts that they were never taught and never learned. But it was there latently within them because they were motivated to repair a world and to gather this material wholeheartedly and to work shoulder to shoulder so that the ultimate achievement would be what we read about at the end of this week's Torah reading, with a harmonious effort, with a tremendous sense of sincerity, and with most especially the light necessary for us to face up to shortcomings, for us to stop rationalizing everything away, for us to stop just feeling as though, well, that's as good as I can do it, but instead to realize that there is a perfection embedded in the world. And if we take tikkun seriously, if we take this process of repairing our own natures, repairing our own hearts, repairing our character, repairing our relationships with other people, and creating a sense of community which has as its goal to close the gap between heaven and earth, we can do so. And that's chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. That's what we have to be. We have to be strenuous for. That's what we have to work on. And that is within our grasp. The great impediment is that we ourselves blow out the candle because we feel as though we've done enough. We feel as though, you can wear the shoes the way they are. I don't need to keep sewing and repairing like that simple shoemaker was doing late into the night to make sure that the shoes were really repaired properly, and to take his full responsibility that if this is my job to make this repair, I'm going to gather the necessary light and clarity and acknowledgement and personal integrity and honesty, and let's get the job done.